Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm Erin O'Neill, Head of Community for the RevOps Co-Op, and with me today are community members and partners, Siva, co-founder and CEO of Everstage, and Adithya, Head of RevOps and Growth at Everstage. They will be sharing their own story into shaping their org into a true RevOps engine and all the things they've learned along the way. So hopefully they can help you too in your own journey. Takeaways from today's talk are exploring why RevOps should be a strategic role, learning the 5 challenges that hold back most RevOps teams, initiative RevOps should choose to gain a seat at the table, and finally, automation of 3 key supporting tasks RevOps needs to do today.
Hey, thanks, Erin. I'm Siva, the founder and CEO of Everstage, and obviously Adith, who also is my colleague from Everstage, who runs the revenue operations and growth. Just a bit of background on our journeys before the role that we're currently doing, right? So both of us come from a revenue operations background. I used to run revenue operations globally for this SaaS unicorn Freshworks. So I saw the journey of scaling the RevOps team when it was a team of 1, which was just me, to 25 members eventually, and through a journey of about 30 million in ARR to over 200 million in ARR during that time. So obviously, RevOps was very nascent when we initially started off. This was obviously about 5 years back, but since then, revenue operations has evolved into much larger and much more commonly spoken of as a function. And during that journey, we had a lot of learnings, both me and Adith, because Adith was also part of the revenue operations team back at Freshworks. He ran he started off with the marketing operations and then evolved into kind of the revenue operations role. So between us, we've learned some of these things the hard way of what we should have done better in our RevOps careers, and kind of leverage the platform and the function better to kind of scale much more faster in the RevOps journey, right? So I think that's really what we thought we'll share in this conversation with all of you today. Quick background on Everstage as well, right? Because obviously at this point we are part of Everstage, but essentially I would say revenue operations and all of the learnings that revenue operations as a function gave us was super critical into building Everstage in the first place. And at the end of the day, we were frustrated as career RevOps folks. We were doing a lot of tactical and recurring busy work, which we thought could be automated. So our mission at Everstage is really to kind of liberate ops from all of this tactical busy work. And we started off this with solving for the commissions processing and commissions administration. So that's Everstage today. It's a no-code sales commissions automation platform. We are early stage, but we already have some large customers like ChargePay and Postman. We're starting off with commissions automation, but our vision is, as I said, much larger, really to solve for revenue operations problems as revenue operations folks ourselves. So really, truly built by RevOps for RevOps, right? So that's our backstory. But let's get back to the discussion that we had on how to really move from a supporting role to a strategic role, right? And this is a question that has not only come up in our own journeys, but we've also had, especially this conversation, come up in several discussions that we've had with peers who are all, stuck up in that zone where they think, hey, you know what? There seems to be a lot of tactical work that's coming my way. I want to really scale up, do some of those strategic things that I have in mind, but I really don't get the time or, the space to do that. So how do I really move and position RevOps as a strategic role, get that seat in the table where, I'm involved in decision making, right? So that's like the looming question a lot of revenue operations folks have. And before we get into how to move there, I think we need to understand a little bit before of what's currently happening and how did we get here, right? So that's what I'm going to share in the next 5 to 10 minutes. And then essentially I'll let Adith talk a little more of how to really move from a supporting role to a strategic role with very pinpointed examples that you could take away of this session. I'm sure all of you could relate to it, this meme that you have right here, right? Like all of us have these, as revenue operations folks, have these strategic initiatives that we want to do. It's on a to-do list. It's something that we want to plan for the quarter, for the year. And then what ends up happening is every new week that comes in, every new day that comes in, you have a ton of emails to answer. You have a ton of Slack messages to kind of solve for. And at the end of the day, it's really you're stuck up there, right? Like by the time you get done with all of those, your week's over, your month's over, and then boom, you don't really get to those initiatives that you really wanted to. And ops as a function broadly is also this peculiar function where RevOps typically doesn't get into limelight when things are going well. Only when you have things to firefight, issues to solve for. That's when ops comes in, and then everybody's like looking at where's the RevOps person. We need to really solve for this. And so a lot of times the function comes into limelight because there's something to firefight, and not really because there's something strategic that can be contributed through the RevOps function, right? So I think the expectation obviously is it's part strategic, part operations, but it tends to be largely operations with very little strategic work that happens in RevOps. Just to go a little before and understand how RevOps really came into play. And obviously RevOps is a function, at least by the definition of revenue operations. Before, in some ways it was called sales operations, business operations, but RevOps obviously now truly encompasses what we want to really call for, and is that strategic function. But before RevOps came into play, obviously all of us were doing different roles, right? Like at least the ones who had been in the space for a much longer time frame, were doing different roles. And typically what we've seen is RevOps as a role. People come into the RevOps role typically from some of these backgrounds. And maybe if we get to those, what we've seen commonly is the analytics role, someone who's been more a CRM administrator, some of them who've been from a finance background, few from sales and marketing. I think, but mostly what I see is folks who come in from some of these backgrounds, right? And essentially what happens is when RevOps function is set up, one of the things that my boss, who's the founder and CEO of Freshworks, used to say is, you ideally want to, when you start off as RevOps, you want to lay that path which really ensures that you optimize for the entire revenue, right from the marketing to sales to customer success, right? But what ends up typically happening is there's a lot of reactive issues to solve for, because that's why, in fact, when companies set up revenue operations, they set it up because there's some issue that's breaking, right? Like there's some process that's not aligning, there's something that's breaking, and that's when first organization decides to kind of set up the revenue operations in the first place. And when you think about it, you want to lay a very clean path, but what typically happens is it's a scenario of which cow, which ditch. And what I mean by that is you want to lay a road that's perfectly paved, but then you have these ditches in the road and there are cows stuck in the ditches. So essentially, the first step is not to lay that perfect road, but to first have these cows taken off the ditches, right? Before you can actually lay the road. So essentially, that's what ends up happening in revenue operations. You have all of these reactive stuff, the transactional stuff that you need to first solve for, the process that's broken that needs to be first solved for, before you can actually lay that perfect path, so that you can automate as much as possible and really focus on items that really add value to the organization, right? So what happens is folks coming in from these backgrounds typically are entrusted with what they are good at. So analytics person is positioned to kind of get back with dashboards and reports, and it's all reactive, right? Like at the end of the month, and whenever the leadership asks for it, the CRM person is really asked to fix the process or set up on the tools side. The finance person is really looking at like the productivity angle, or just the cost associated with some of these functions in the first place. So some of these inherent biases of where people come from also get transitioned to the revenue operations functions itself. And that's something that we've seen very commonly. What this leads to kind of as a problem, therefore, is, as I said, transactional work, completely unfulfilled potential, and not being involved in a lot of strategic projects. And also what happens is RevOps gets to start seen as, this function which is trying to find, issues with, like the sales team or, productivity issues or whatever. And essentially sales starts to not view ops as a friend, but more as a function to be careful about, right? Like, so that kind of a setup starts to eventually evolve in the RevOps journey. And ultimately, I think from what we've seen, I think revenue operations from our personal experiences is truly strategic function. And so what we've seen is there's an absolutely strong case for RevOps to be a strategic role. And why do I say that? That's the very purpose of actually setting up revenue operations in the first place, right? Because we live in the world today that it's very hard to say when marketing ends and when sales begins. For that matter, when sales ends and when customer success begins. Because this true customer journey really goes across all of these different functions. And you have obviously these, focus functions of marketing, sales, and customer success. But revenue operations is that glue that kind of gets across all of the customer journey and has that context of what's happening in each part of the journey, right? And that's super powerful because the only other roles where there's such visibility are typically the leadership roles of, say, the chief revenue officer or the chief executive officer. There's no other role in the company that has end-to-end visibility of the customer journey as much as revenue operations has, right? And also, the other thing that happens with RevOps is typically RevOps has a very close understanding of the leadership vision because RevOps participates in discussions around the annual planning and how to transition that into actual operations and the regular cadence as you go through the year. So has that perspective of the leadership, but at the same time also understands the ground reality, right? So it's not only looking at the entire thing at the 30,000 feet view, but also has specific understanding of, hey, you know what? Some of these are, great on spreadsheets, but might not work practically because of so and so reason, right? And truly cross-functional. And we've gone through those roles. And personally, I could say, as a founder right now of SaaS company, the last few years of my journey as a revenue operations professional has set me up for such a good position in terms of understanding of how to go about setting up functions across the customer journey. And I owe it all back to my revenue operations role and being able to transition to that strategic perspective in revenue operations, right? And I'm sure there's going to be more founders from RevOps. There's going to be more CXOs from RevOps function. I think there's a lot that this function can be responsible for and truly play that strategic role. And I think I'll hand it over to Adit to kind of talk about some of the actionable takeaways that you could go after this discussion to go ahead and do in your respective roles to make sure you really move from that role of transactional work to strategic work. So over to Adit.
Hey everyone, again, thanks for editing. So let's get down into the specifics of it, right? Like the meaty part of this is basically what can you do as DevOps, right? Like I'm going to keep it as much as possible to reality. I want to be quoting examples as much as I can. And let's start with one of the fundamental, let's start with the challenges and let's approach what are the different solutions that we can do as well, right? Like the first is one of the things Siva shared about, right? Like the sales don't share risk with you. GTM team has this inherent bias, hey, DevOps is a team that's going to scrutinize me and they're going to be complaining about me probably to leadership team and I'm going to be in trouble. So they don't want to share risk with you. So how do you break this barrier and build a relationship with them, right? Like you start with various different processes here, right? Like first is when it comes to sales teams or marketing teams, generally they all have a quota setting process, right? And what happens during this quota setting process is basically a lot of times it's a conversation between management teams, leadership teams, and finance team is involved. And finally, they standardize the quota and every team gets assigned the same quota at some point in time, right? Like there might be some regional nuances, but at some point they're going to make that sacrifice and going to assign all of them on a scale. And usually, based on at least, when I handle the rest of the world regions, there are different markets, Asia Pacific region, Australia, New Zealand region, Middle East and African regions. And what happens there basically is all of these are not the same regions, right? Like even if you take Europe, Eastern Europe and your UK and France and Spain are not the same regions, you're going to end up having a lot of variances in terms of territory potential. And the targets that they carry needs to be adjusted. So as RevOps, I think this is one of the early learnings for me is to get involved in this process try to make a case to the leadership team, right? Like, because the best way for the salespeople to trust you is basically to bring their problems to leadership attention, and leaders, whenever they're going to listen from a sales guy, they're going to be assuming that there is some amount of complaining that every sales guy does to reduce your quota, right? So as RevOps, what you can do is basically add some data to that process, right? Like, hey, make a case for that with data to the leadership team. And all of a sudden, now you have a different use case altogether, right? Like, you're acting as a champion for sales team and ensuring fairness in quota setting. So that's, I think, one of the very actionable stuff that I've done that has at least helped me build relationship, right? And this, again, the second point here is super important because as a GTM team, you have to echo your problems to the leadership team. And it's not just your sales leadership teams. You also have to start doing to the product team, right? Because a lot of time what happens is you have seen if there are any sales reps, you would have seen unfair churn happening to the sales reps that gets them demotivated. And main reason might be during the closing of a deal, the product team might have committed a feature, and all of a sudden after 6 months down the line, the customer was not delivered the feature, and the customer is fully worried about it, right? So the customer leaves, and sometimes this can be a big logo as well. So how do we ensure the product team is accountable? Because product team lives in their world where they want to be laser focused on customers and the market trends and adapt to it, and they might as well ignore and deprioritize some of the sales as some customer asks, right? So in that way, at least as a neutral party, because if sales brings it up to product team, they're going to be biased in the process. But as a neutral party, if RevOps can make a case with data and make them accountable, that's another way I think you can build a trust with the sales team, right? Because one of the biggest problems most of the sales team have is going to be with product teams, not delivering on what they promised for. And the next part is your marketing and sales alignment, right? A classic one, marketing is always complaining, hey, we're giving good quality leads, sales is not doing enough justice. And sales is complaining, marketing is not giving me good quality leads. How do you fix this? And in our previous firm, we spent around almost for first year completely fixing this as RevOps. We got in a new lead gen tool called MatGuru, got it implemented. And it took us, the marketing and sales team did not immediately agree to use this tool. It took us a lot of learnings, and we had to force it after a point in time to ensure that happened. But it happened over a period of a year where we showed a lot of data that this had good impact on the overall revenue as well. And slowly started building this alignment, right? Between marketing and sales, what RevOps can do to truly unlock the value there is to ensure that there is full transparency, right? Show marketing's information and data and metrics to sales teams and show the same to the sales team so that there is some underlying trust built and they can move on to secondary problems, right? You don't want them to be focused on data and ignore the secondary problems of how can I improve conversion rate in this region? How can I get more quality leads in this region? So doing these things at least will align them and make them view RevOps as a common person who's trying to help them out rather than being worried about what is RevOps going to do next. I think this is one of the classic cases where a lot of us spend time on. So it starts as a one-time exercise. You start doing it for a quarter, and then you realize every week you're going to be spending 5 hours on it, and every month, beginning and month end is completely going to be occupied with this, right? Managing your sales data, maintaining your CRM records, or ensuring proper quotas assigned to people. It just ends up a lot of manual time spent on this, and not just telling us coming from a commission software, but you look at your commissions process, and it's been there for plenty of years now, and it's been thoroughly be tested and automated in a lot of systems, but we still end up using Excel. That is, as RevOps, there's a lot of benefit in automating some of these things out. And it's all exciting initially to do these and ensuring payouts are fair and communicated to reps. But at some point, it's going to end up consuming a lot of bandwidth. You're going to have a lot of exceptions every time, right? Because the process involves you communicating to reps your payouts, the reps coming back with corrections, and post payout, the reps coming back with their assumption of what they could have gotten paid and what they got paid, and some issues with that. So this ends up taking a lot of time, and this distracts you from your core work of doing more strategic work as well. So automating some of these things are also something as RevOps you should be focusing on. And the next one, right, QTC workflows. So I'm not just advocating for tools here, but when it comes to QTC workflows, I'll give you a classic examples, right? Why it's important to have a QTC workflow. So in one of our previous regions, this happened 2-3 years ago in a firm where one of the customers got committed hey, you'll get a refund on licenses if in case you don't use it. And that's something that's not company policy, but it was a new region, and we didn't have enough standardized templates or documents that sales are mandated to use. So sales went with their own documents and they made edits to the existing documents and they signed this with the customer. Like the same customer was given unreasonable SLA expectations as well. So because of that, it took us at most next 2 years to even solve the billing issues for this customer. So the customer said he won't pay, and we ended up spending a lot of time on this to ensure the customer paid at least some part of his billing. And this is something you don't want to have to deal with, right? Like these kinds of surprises, really take up your bandwidth, really blindside you from doing what you want to do. And this is something you should completely avoid. So even if you don't want to get a tool, just put up standard processes on hey, what's a discounting policy? What can you allow and what can you not allow? And what is a normal quote supposed to look like? Is something deviating the normal? You need to be on top of those things and cut them at the root level of where it is happening. Because if you don't do it, where you're going to end up is basically all of a sudden 1 month you're going to be spending with one customer figuring out this billing issue, because finance is going to put their hand up and then say, hey, sales made a bad sale and now the customer is not willing to pay. It's on you guys, you solve for it. And the same thing next, right? Sales conflicts, right? Every time, a company grows by 10 to 20 people, there is a revisit in employee size all of sales reps end up making. And hey, the company's revenue has changed, the company's number of employees has changed, now it needs to belong into my territory. And this happens all the time, right? As RevOps people, if you don't solve for this at the curb and ensure there's a standard policy put in place, you're going to have a hard time convincing salespeople to follow, right? And these policies need not be very a legal document as well. Because one thing I've learned is when it comes to sales policy documents, sales people don't require fairness, they require consistency. They want to be ensured that no matter what happens, if they follow certain processes, they're going to get paid for the deal. They don't want that ambiguity in that mind, hey, am I going to get paid for the deal or not? Or they don't want to be thinking about, hey, if I say this customer belongs to this employee size or this revenue bucket, I'm going to get paid or not. So putting a sales policy document that clearly outlines this, you can start small. It can be a 5-page document that you can put on a smaller territory and eventually start expanding. But once you start putting those policy documents in place and you start enforcing them, that will really save a lot of time from the CRM conflicts, right? Because every time there is a territory conflict or an account conflict, you're going to have to spend up time, right? It's not going to be an easy mail that you're going to have to type. That mail, you're going to have to spend 2 hours, 3 hours researching and ensuring, hey, who did what, which sales rep spoke first, which region this got sourced from, where did the sign up come from. And all of these are a lot of unnecessary work that we end up putting on ourselves because we haven't put a proper policy in place that sales reps can refer to and solve their problems without any ambiguity, right? That's one thing. And another thing is also the expectation setting, right? A lot of times, salespeople escalate on RevOps, something as simple as hey, I have raised a query 2 days ago, it has not been resolved. And that might have even been unreasonable ask that we are not even supposed to respond to, but still they will escalate this, to leadership saying, hey, RevOps has not solved this problem, my revenue is stuck. So when it comes to your standard CRM processes, right, hey, if there is a Salesforce issue, the deal is not reflecting in my VI tool, what is the SLA you're going to set? We will resolve this within 2 days, just publish it so that tomorrow you're not being put into this escalation, because your sales manager and sales leader at the end of the month, if a sales rep complains to them or escalates to them, they're going to immediately pull in you and they're going to spend a lot of time. But if the expectation is already set, you can simply reply saying, hey, this is still within my SLA, so this will get solved quickly. So you don't have to give in to all those escalations that happens. And the next thing, again, is one of the most important things I've learned is the ad hoc request piece, right? A lot of times, this happens, right? Salespeople use RevOps as confirmation bias, right? They have a insight that they think is is gonna help their case for an argument they are making, and they'll use RevOps and ask them to help with an analysis and data point, and we pull it up, and all of a sudden they start using the data point, right? And we end up doing a lot of analysis after analysis. And an interesting thing is, in some of these analysis, we're going to have multiple insights, but one insight might even contradict the other insight, but they're just going to use what exactly is going to help their case and just push the other things to the side, right? That's why you need to put up a clear policy in terms of what are all the number of ad hoc requests that you can take up in a month, And analysis after analysis without any meaningful action is useless. Like everyone wants to look at data nowadays. Everyone wants to be actionable and data driven. But unless a sales team has shown inclination to do that, to stop stop saying no to these kinds of requests, because it's really not gonna help us, right? Like it's just gonna be used against us, or whenever we come up with a similar insight which is good enough, they're not gonna consider it because it doesn't fit into their bias or preconceived notion. So saying no to ad hoc requests is one of the most important things I've learned, which is also very difficult to implement, but also helps in the long run to set that expectation. The next thing, right? Like so, basically, again, being pulled into these escalations, right? This is again a little controversial. I think there are some people I've seen on LinkedIn who also agrees to this philosophy as well. So give us a like here if you are also someone who has done. See, we are RevOps as a role. Our main mandate is to ensure we improve revenue and focus on solving for the GTM efficiencies, bring leadership attention to critical areas of growth and risk involved, right? And I, like any other guy, loves as much as spending time on reporting or fixing my CRM as much as possible. But at some point, at least once your company is at some level of scale, you have to realize something there. Basically, an analytics career person with proper business intelligence training and a Power BI training or Tableau training is going to have a completely different level of efficiency compared to an operations person. Because of our nature of work, we're always going to be involved in both tactical and strategic work. And this part is not just belongs to both of them, it's a specialized work. Running your database and maintaining reports and updating the visualizations properly, meeting the sales need. This is all purely specialized work. And we definitely don't have to be good in it. We don't have to be good in Salesforce. We can understand how to set up Salesforce and understand the basics. As long as we want something get done, we can at least make the case for it. But there are people who spend their careers on becoming a Salesforce administrators. And so to concede to these experts when it comes to these kinds of requests and these kinds of activities will really go a long way to free up your bandwidth. You think about something like tech stack, like today when it comes to RevOps tech stack or a sales ops tech stack, you're going to get a lot of tools across the board, and a lot of exciting new products are coming along every day which solves for forecasting issues or your analytics issues and so on. So what you do is as RevOps, your job is to figure out and stay on the cutting edge in terms of, hey, what are the different tools or products that I can implement to solve for my business use cases. But solutionizing them and actually implementing them need not be your core area of expertise. You can outsource it. If there is an IT team in your company, go to them. Outsource this project to them. Be a stakeholder in the project. Have a say. When it comes to reporting outsource, all I'm saying is move your reporting to your BI team. Own the metrics and definition. Right? That's something you cannot afford to concede. But move the reporting itself to them. If there are reporting requests or changes that needs to happen, let them take that up. It's okay to concede on these things so that you can focus on the harder problems that no one else can do, right? Because as RevOps, you have insights into marketing, customer success and sales. And there are things that require all of these three things to come together to solve for the customer journey. A reporting project is not something that's gonna really fit into as much as a harder problem as this. So you really need to stop delegating and getting out of some of these problems. And the next part, right, again, this is the most important part everyone wants us to do, right? So basically, hey, how do I move to strategy, right? Just before that, right, what is strategy is basically bringing leadership attention to certain areas of growth or risk with proper data and return on investment, right? That's all strategy is about mainly. You have to get the leadership attention to critical areas of risks and growth in your firm. And how do you do that, right? You have all these insights, you're looking at all these different buckets. How do you connect them all and do it together, right? Here is where you need to differentiate between being a reactive RevOps and a proactive RevOps, right? You need to start putting up your hand and then start taking initiatives, set up recurring strategy discussions. What do you mean by that? So let's simply put it this way. I'll give you an example that has happened, right? This was a forecasting meeting for the end of a quarter, and it was 2 weeks before the quarter end, and the sales leader, all of a sudden is going to be falling short on the forecast. And there were heated discussions around hey, why are we going to be falling short? And all of a sudden, there are a couple of curveballs thrown around, and then said hey, This has been a long time problem in marketing and lead gen in this region, no one has addressed before. And our competitors are really outpricing us and we are not able to win against them, right? So let's just abstract these two problems and look at it with data, right? Like something like, hey, marketing lead gen problem is not really a very hard, problem to, come as a surprise because you already have data for that problem. And if the problem is actually as big, you would have had that data to validate. But it just thrown around the garden. They want to just do something to save them, and all of a sudden they put it out there, and we won't have data during these discussions, right, to back this up. So RevOps will be blindsided, and all of a sudden it will look like, hey, RevOps, why are you not on top of things? And something like the competitors are pricing me, right? Like that's something just salespeople pulls up, right? Like say, you really can't have enough data to validate the data unless all your salespeople are following CRM policies. You have all those deals maintained properly with which competitor, why did we lose, where did we lose only due to pricing? You're really not going to be able to make the case for it. But the salesperson there and sales leader there is not looking to make a case for it. They just want to ensure, hey, at this point in time, what can I do to, to convince everyone that this is the reason I'm going to miss the quota. How do we ensure this doesn't happen, right? Because whenever this happens, it doesn't really look good on us, right? Like this is where this comes into play, right? Like every month when the review happens, right? Like there will be a review with leadership team and sales and RevOps, but there should also be a review that happens between RevOps and leadership teams, the sales leadership teams. So what do you do? Every month after the month closes, right? Like just look at the performance metrics, right? Hey, these are the 20 different salespeople that are there, and this is their attainment. It's something out of the ordinary. Has someone overachieved or someone underachieved? What is happening here? If you're handling different teams and then look at marketing, customer success, see the anomalies and see a pattern there, and then start saying, hey, this seems to be happening for the last 3 months. There's something wrong with this region or territory, and we're consistently missing numbers. And start putting these in a tracker, right? Bring this up. The first month you bring it up, they'll be like, hey, this is just one thing that you're going to bring it up. The second month and third month, you start bringing this up, right? Like you really start putting them in a tracker and tracking, and that's when they realize, okay, this is a problem. So once you start forecasting, risk before they appear, that's when you start being more strategic, right? Like, because that's what strategy is all about, figuring out things before they happen so that we can solve for it and we can take new initiatives to solve for it. And basically, based on this, what you'll be able to do in terms of your annual planning, right? Like when next year, let's say you do this for 3 months, 6 months, what's going to happen is next year when you're going to do the annual planning, and we have seen for the last 12 months how a particular region's challenges have been. What are all the different, what is the average quota, that they are able to attain, and what is the average ramp time. You can use all this to make a case for a broader ask in the next, show for a proper risk assessment, and then say, hey, I know we're planning for this much in this region for next year, but there are some genuine risks that's going to happen, and which is going to prevent us from going and achieving this. So once you start putting these recurring discussions, and once you start going into annual planning with this level of insight, right? So that's when you get a seat at the table, right? Once you know exactly what's happening on the ground reality, once you know exactly what is the problem with each sub-territory in that region, and what is the solution we're looking for. Is that a hiring problem, or is it a branding problem, or is this a retention problem? You keep tracking that every month and put them all in a tracker, and you bring them to the annual planning, and you will immediately start seeing this results. And I think all of this is a lot of work. It's not just some random things. All of this takes a lot of effort, and we also have some leadership mandate as well. So let's just talk about how we can make this make this happen, right? So basically a lot of work needs to be changing the inherent biases within your firm, and then showing them that they can trust RevOps. And you can't just say you can have to trust RevOps. You have to show that in your action. Start helping the salespeople. Start automating your repetitive manual tasks. Put up processes and streamline policies to ensure that you have enough time to help sales teams. So once you start doing that, right, that's how you start adding value. At least in my personal experience, when I started doing this second time, right, I was initially handling partnerships market, and then I moved into the rest of the world market. But when I went into the rest of the world market as RevOps, with my past experience, what I did was first is observe the things for a couple of months, understand the critical pieces of the business, build relationships and trust first, ask questions later. First, build the trust, hey, you're there to help them, you're there to solve the problem, and you're genuinely looking just to help out, and there is nothing else. and then start gaining the context of the business. So once you start doing that, and once they start opening up to you, then doing all this, right? Like once you have opened up to a sales leader and you have established a strong trust factor with them, then inviting them for a one-on-one meeting at the end of the month to review the team performance and look at their strategic problems, it's going to be very simple. They're going to be open to do something like that with someone that they trust. But if you start right away and gonna go take their data points and say, hey, your team is not doing well, your team has this problem, they're really not gonna come up and open up, and it's not gonna set you up on the right path. And all of this, it's all coming from the fact that like RevOps right now, as much as it's trending in the software businesses, what I'm seeing again and again is a lot of other companies have also started to realize the need to establish a centralized ops function that looks at both product and revenue put together. And we're still all we're all relatively new to RevOps, and it's still very early in RevOps, I would say. It's not as mature as other fields. It's just they've been there at least hardcore for the past 5 years. So even though this is a lot of effort, I think if you walk the talk and execute and work with salespeople with constant communication, then I think it's just a matter of time. You move on to a more strategic role and get a seat at the table in your firm. Hey, which slide was that, Erin, where you said we can have an entire talk on that slide?
Oh my gosh. It was actually almost most of them. I think it was slide number 4. That was the one that I clued into just because I was thinking like, yeah, that sounds great, but it's easier said than done. How do you actually achieve that? Not being pulled into things unnecessarily, and then creating those boundaries and expectations from the team.
I'll give my quick personal experience on that. Right, one of the biggest projects we took before I left Freshworks is to outsource our analytics to the BI team completely, and just own the metrics definition. And initially, there was obviously a lot of trust issues, and we were worried whether they'll do justice or are they going to be coming up with the report themselves and share it with sales teams. And we went through a phase for 6 months, and then eventually, it took a lot of back and forth and fight to establish that. But once we established the boundaries, right, what we really realized is, hey, reporting is fairly streamlined now. So if some numbers go wrong, salespeople are not pinging us and saying the numbers are wrong. They're just pinging the technical Power BI team directly and checking with them whether the numbers are wrong. So that really, freed up our bandwidth. We were spending at least 8 to 10 hours at the end of every month, with a lot of back and forth as, hey, why is my number not reflecting? And once we started doing this, right, it still did not go away as much, but it got reduced a lot because it went into a specialized team who's built the career on analytics and reporting. And all of a sudden, the hours saved for RevOps, that 8 to 10 hours at the end of the month was so helpful, right? So that's at least my experience when it comes to outsourcing analytics.
Stephen Kolstad says, in one of the beginning slides, you mentioned automating manual tasks, one of which was automating commissions. Anyone aboard here have a real world situation to share around complexities of that, like overpayments, underpayments, manual, and if so, can you quantify it? Experiencing churn due to lack of trust. So he'd appreciate any feedback on that.
Yeah, maybe let me take that. I think, Stephen, one of the things in automation of any process is obviously to define a clear plan and also criteria for some of the situations that you see that typically happen, right? And in the case of commissions, I presume from whatever you've written, you have a case of a lot of these situations of payments which have gone different from what you intended to pay because, I don't know, I think probably because of manual errors, or for example, because there's some churn and therefore you need to claw back and all of that. So I think one of the things to first do is basically define your commission plan that really at least addresses some of the key aspects that you want to conquer, right? Because at the end of the day, all of us know incentives drive behavior. And so your commission plan really needs to capture some of those important aspects as part of the different criteria that you want to set, so that you first are able to ensure that you are, in cases where there are such situations, you're able to do a certain process to kind of say clawback or do some correction for in the first place, right? And once that is defined and you kind of codify it in some sense, you could certainly automate it, right? Because now you know that this is the criteria. You could say, hey, if this happens, then we are going to do this. because this is the kind of structure that we put. So you could really go about automating it once you kind of ensure that you set that clear boundaries and structure in place as part of your commission plan. I think that would be my suggestion to you there. Yeah, talking about what are your thoughts on the best way to build a RevOps team? Have a team of people who have mixed bag of experience, sales ops, mark ops, or have someone who has specialized knowledge in each area? Great question, Ruth. So I think one of the things with RevOps is there are not many people who've done RevOps, right? So you obviously have to kind of open it out a bit and actually have folks who've had different experiences, because at the end of the day, again, honestly, this is not rocket science, right? You could have people come in, pick up the specific areas. Might take a few months additionally, but it's okay, because at the end of the day, what you want to solve for is people who have problem solving skills, who are good in unearthing not only from a data standpoint but also insights. And when I say insights, go to the ground, understand the reality of why something's happening, because data doesn't always give you the perspective of why something's happening. So someone who's a problem solver, someone who's essentially can go in and have those go deeper and understand what's happening, also with good communication skills, because there's a lot of stakeholder management as well involved. I think these are the basic set of skill sets that I would say. And you could open this out to folks outside of just the ops team, and not really only worry about having to choose folks that only have the specialized knowledge, because honestly, there are not so many people today who have the specialized knowledge in each area of RevOps. Probably that will be the case a few years down the line when there's much more RevOps roles that are opening up and people have that experience. But at this point, I think you could still have it a little more generic with some of these fundamental skill sets to think of before kind of building your RevOps team.
I think that ties in well to JM's question as well. Just curious about what are the exact roles and functions you see as RevOps.
So I think it depends obviously on also the your focus as a business. But one of the common things, obviously, like everybody says, is there is a focus on the marketing operations, there's a sales operations, and there's the customer success operations. Some typically what happens is sales and customer success overlap quite a bit, but with marketing operations, typically it gets pretty deep, and the marketing tech stack itself is actually very complex sometimes. So that becomes a very deep function in itself. And sales ops and customer success ops could be together in case you don't have bandwidth for multiple people to operate off. So that could be kind of the start of place. But eventually, as you grow, as you become larger, what happens is even within sales ops, things need to get bifurcated or further split, right? Because you might have a direct sales team, you might have the channel partners in the indirect sales, you might have to split by geography. If you have categories of business where you're selling to smaller businesses as well as to say mid-market or enterprise, you might want to solve for that go-to-market motion as well. So it can really start getting specialized over time. But if you were to just start off, then I think at least that's the marketing ops and sales customer success ops together would be those two areas where you could start off building your RevOps teams as bifurcations.
Stephen wants to know, if you had to pick one metric for your sales team to track, what would it be and why?
One metric for your sales team to track. I think it's hard to say one metric, but I think one of the things that really encompasses, if you were to measure, this the right way, is qualified leads to conversion into win rates, right? Because that kind of captures a lot of different areas on how optimized the sales process is, how optimized your sales teams are to a large extent. So, I mean, ideally, I wouldn't obviously restrict to one metric, but probably a metric that largely captures, how good the process is, how effective, the whole team is the conversion rates from qualified leads to win rates.
Thank you, Adith and Siva. This has been very informative. See you guys around the community. Thanks, guys. See you later.